Peter Singher is probably the world's most controversial philosopher. He coined the phrase animal liberation as a book title, often described as the Bible of the animal rights movement. And he believes the human exploitation of animals is no more justified than the exploitation of other people. But it's Singer's views on abortion and euthanasia that have led to death threats against this soft-spoken Ivy League academic. Peter Singher, the New Yorker magazine has described you as the world's most influential living philosopher. Others take a different view. They have denounced you as the most dangerous man in the world today. It's not often I get a chance to interview the most dangerous man in the world today. But that's because of the views that you have articulated, views which I expect have brought some danger to you personally and in terms of your freedom to express those views.
Some, I guess. I mean, I think that most dangerous man stuff is ridiculous, and actually since 9/11 people have stopped talking about it. I guess bin Laden has edged ahead of me, you could say. As far as personal security is concerned, I was somewhat concerned when I came to Princeton, because I did get death threats, and it's known that members of the anti-abortion movement had murdered doctors and firebombed clinics that were doing abortions. One of the people who was suspected, subsequently convicted of shooting a doctor who carried out abortions with a high-powered rifle, was still at large. So, yes, I had to be somewhat worried about that, but I didn't really see that I had much choice either. I had to still go on with my life.
We'll come to that particularly controversial view which prompts some of that reaction to you in a moment, but I want to start with your views on animals, where you began to make your reputation internationally in the 1970s. You're probably the most famous vegetarian in the world. You're the author of a book, Animal Liberation, which is often described as the Bible of the animal welfare movement. What made you a vegetarian?
I became a vegetarian because I started thinking about the ethical question of whether we're entitled to treat animals as we do when we raise them on farms, which nowadays, of course, are overwhelmingly intensive factory farms, and slaughter them and turn them into food. I was challenged to think about that by simply having lunch with someone who was a vegetarian when I was a graduate student at Oxford. That led me to think about the issue, to start reading about it. I hadn't known much about factory farming, for instance. This is in the early 1970s. Although at first I tried to find ways of defending and justifying a subordinate status for animals so that we're entitled to treat them the way we did, in the end I came to think that you can't, that it's all kind of a prejudice, speciesism, that we think that our species is superior just because we're human to them, and that therefore we're entitled to use them as means to our ends, as Kant, for example, an 18th century German philosopher, said. But there's really no philosophical principle on which you can ground the idea that they're just things. I mean, obviously they're sentient beings, they can suffer, they can feel pain. Their interests should count. So that's why I think there are differences in the wrongness of killing, and why I don't object to killing animals as such, but I do object to inflicting suffering on them as such.
If we could humanely, painlessly kill an animal and slaughter that animal and use its meat within the food industry, would that be morally legitimate?
Well, I mean, I would have far fewer objections to that than I do to current practices. If animals really had, good lives, what they need in terms of their biological, physical needs, also their social needs and emotional needs, because if we're talking about birds and mammals, they certainly have social and emotional lives. And if, all that happened was that they were then painlessly killed prematurely, I would be less troubled by that. You might still want to ask other questions as to why this was necessary, given that we can nourish ourselves well without doing it. But, that's something I'm certainly prepared to debate.
Is animal experimentation ever legitimate?
The question should more be about the institution and the practice of animal experimentation as we have it today, which I think is premised on the idea that animal interests don't count or don't count very much. And that's really what I'm opposed to, just the idea that, you know, you can walk into a lab on Monday morning and say, well, I need 200 rats or 50 rabbits or a dozen monkeys or something to do the research. And although, you know, you may have to go through an ethics committee or a review from the Home Office or whatever it might be, that review is not really based on the idea that the interests of these animals are comparably important to similar interests.
Let's come to what is easily the most controversial position you have defended: infanticide, the legitimacy of infanticide, the killing of recently born infants under certain circumstances. Right. What are those circumstances?
Well, firstly, what I'm saying is that I think that in some cases where infants are born with serious disabilities, the parents and doctors together should be able to choose that the child should not live. And having made that choice, they should be able to make sure that the child then dies swiftly and humanely. And I put it that way for two reasons. Firstly, I'm not here to say, you know, this child should live and this child shouldn't. You might have two children with exactly the same disability, one with a family who wants to love and care for that child and do everything possible for it, another with a family who says, look, we think this life is, you know, starting under such poor prospects that we really think it's better that the baby not live, and then maybe we'll have another child with better prospects. So I think it's, you know, both of those families should be able to make their choices and should be supported by the community and the government with resources to assist the child if they decide that the child should live, or permitted to end the child's life humanely if they think it's better the child should not.
Up to a certain point in time?
Well, I think it's actually hard to draw a cut-off line. Now, that is something on which I've changed. 20 years or so ago, I wrote a book in which my co-author and I suggested a 28-day cut-off, which was based on an ancient Greek ritual that you performed 28 days after birth, when you carried the baby around the hearth of the home and you accepted the baby into the community, and after that you could no longer expose the baby on the hillside, as used to be done with disabled babies. So, you know, we thought, well, maybe that's a suitable cutoff. And that is around the time, I think, when it's starting to get a bit late, because there's usually more bonding between family and child. But I wouldn't say that you could have a rigid cutoff, really, I think.
Before they're self-aware?
Yes, when they're clearly not self-aware.
That's important.
I think that that's a reasonable way of marking a distinction. Obviously, development of self-awareness is gradual. And that's why it's hard to find any sharp lines. Basically, I would say I think these decisions should be made as soon as possible after birth, as soon as, you know, the medical information and the family have had time to assimilate that, maybe to inquire about the condition, perhaps to consult with organizations of people who have that disability, or parents of people with children with that disability, so that they can really inform themselves properly on the issue.
There are other ways of looking at this, of course. Couldn't one say, for example, that personhood, or what it is to be a person, is a deeply mysterious thing? And although we have no clear definition of that, we can recognize persons when we see them. Peter Singer is a person. Stephen Hawking is a person. The deaf Beethoven is a person. A child born with a disability is a person even before 28 days.
Well, I think we need to talk about these border cases, if you like, and try and decide if this is a mysterious intuition, how we know. I mean, let's say a child born without a brain, with a brain stem, so they're not brain dead, but with nothing more in the brain. So this child will never be able to recognize his or her mother, will never smile at another human being as they come in the room, will never communicate in any way, will not feel anything either. Is that a person?
Yes. Why isn't it a person?
Well, because I don't think that the only thing that we can say about this child is that biologically it's a member of our species born to human parents. I think the notion of personhood, and this is not incidentally original to me, this is something that goes all the way back through philosophers like John Locke, in fact to early Christian philosophers like Boethius, who were debating what it is to be a person when they discussed the doctrine of the Trinity. And they said, well, a person is a rational substance. So this baby with no brain is not a rational substance. It's not rational now. It never will be rational.
You don't accept, obviously, the traditional notion of the sanctity of human life. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, as I said, it's speciesist. I mean, it's limited to human beings. It says that biologically being a member of the species Homo sapien is enough to make your life more sacred, more entitled to protection than the life of, for example, a chimpanzee who is not a member of our species, who is far more self-aware, far more rational, far more capable of emotionally connecting with other beings, with loving her child, let's say, if it's a female chimpanzee, than a human being with anencephaly, the condition we were talking about, could ever be. That seems to me just a mere prejudice in favour of members of our species.
A being with Alzheimer's, a human being with Alzheimer's. This was a personal experience of your own with your late mother.
My mother did unfortunately suffer from Alzheimer's towards the end of her life. Yes.
And I think some critics, in a sense, used that example to criticise you further and suggested that your response to your mother was somehow inconsistent with your own moral perspective.
Yes, and I'm not, I mean, I think they were a bit muddled as to in what way they thought it was inconsistent. I mean, certainly there's nothing in my view that says that we ought to kill beings who are not persons. I mean, that would be absurd. I don't think that's true of non-human animals either. So it's not that, I don't think anybody could say, well, it's consistent with my view that I ought to have ended my mother's life when she lost self-awareness. The more serious criticism, I think, connects to a different aspect of my views, and that is that I've argued strongly that we ought to be doing a lot more to help people in developing countries who are desperately poor and whose lives we can save by giving them some of the money we have. So, of course, it cost a significant amount for me and my sister, I should say, it wasn't only me, to maintain my mother and care for her. And so I think there is probably a criticism that does actually connect with things that I've said, that says, well, was this expenditure worth it? And in that sense, I think the criticism of what my sister and I did for my mother is more like, the criticism that I might incur if I spend money on some luxury that I don't really need. And, to that I certainly plead guilty, yes. I'm not perfect in either of those respects.
Some would see your reaction to your mother in this case as actually an example of morally laudatory behaviour, not a sign of imperfection.
Yes, I know they would, because they have a strong view about obligations of people to their families and those who are close, and they have very little sense of obligation towards strangers. I guess I'm different to some extent. I obviously do think that it's normal and natural and not something that we should reject for people to be concerned about their families and their children and to do more for them than they do for strangers. But I think that there are limits to that, and I perhaps see a stronger obligation to be impartial in terms of what we do to save lives and to reduce the burden of disease and misery and suffering. And I think that now that we have a more globalized world in which we can know very well what people are suffering in distant continents, and we can have non-government organizations like Oxfam or whatever it might be to get assistance to them, I think that we ought to be doing much more than we are. UNICEF says that 30,000 children under 5 a day die from preventable causes, 10 million a year. And certainly there are a lot of adults as well who die from causes that are preventable. So if we could relatively easily, just by giving away a small amount of what we earn, some of the luxuries that we spend money on daily without even thinking about it, restaurant meals, theatre tickets, vacations in foreign countries, even things like buying bottled water when there's perfectly drinkable, safe water coming out of the tap. All of those things are luxuries that 1 billion people in the world could never dream of having, and that could actually be life-saving for some of those people. So, murderer, that's a strong term, but certainly callously indifferent.
But people are dying.
Yes, people are dying, and there is something that we could be doing about it. And, you can have murder by neglect, I guess. So, I want to say it's certainly part of that same spectrum.
How much do we need to do in terms of someone who has an average income? How much does that person need to do to avoid criticisms of moral indecency or quasi-murderer status?
Well, I mean, in a way, I think it's surprisingly small. I think if people of average income were to give 10% of what they earn to organisations working for the developing countries, and if those with significantly above average income were to give something more, maybe 20% or whatever, we could, I think, quite comfortably deal with the large-scale extreme poverty around the world. In fact, probably it wouldn't even really need the 10% if everybody was contributing. Some estimates go as low as 2%. But given that not everybody is contributing, in practical ethics some years ago, I suggested this sort of tithe, the traditional 10%, as something that, if people were to give, well, we could certainly say they've made a significant gesture. That's something substantial. It's not just throwing a few coins in a box when it's waved under your nose. And they could certainly claim to have done their fair share.
I know you're going to say I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good here, and giving something is better than giving nothing. But if I've paid all of my bills, if I've met all my costs in terms of my standard of living, why 10%? Why not 30%? Why not 40%? And can I ever legitimately have a second home or a second car?
I mean, it's the term legitimately here, I guess, that is the problem. I mean, I think that certainly, ideally, while other people are starving, you should not have a second home or a second car. And, that's something that we should aspire to. But I'm not going to criticize you if you do give 10% and you nevertheless have enough for that second home or second car, because I'm certainly, very far from doing all that I should do myself. So,
you have a second home?
I guess, in a sense, I do together with others, a shared place. Yes. So yeah, I mean that's a luxury that I could do without. I agree, and so that's why I'm not really going to criticise people. I think there's a problem, if you like, of simply overcoming things that are part of our nature, which are to look towards ourselves and our family more than we really should. And I think as long as we're conscious of that and we're trying to do more and to gradually perhaps increase the amount we're giving while others are in such need, I think that's enough to say that you're behaving in a morally decent way.
These are fascinating ideas, and we're sitting here in Princeton University, and you're a Princeton philosophy professor, and the ideas have a certain context here in that you're exploring your own moral principles to the nth degree, following the logic of it. And you're often complimented for following the logic of your own argument, wherever it takes you to, however unpalatable to other people that conclusion might seem. I just wonder what the world would look like if these ivory-towered ideas, as they currently are, were to become enacted in law, if people were to act in practice in the way that Peter Singer is describing as a moral life.
Look, I'd reject the ivory-towered claim. I mean, the ideas that we've been talking about are in practice by significant numbers of people in a lot of different countries. So we have lots of people who are vegetarians or vegans for ethical reasons. As far as the views about euthanasia are concerned, I mean, some of those are in practice in the Netherlands, I think with generally satisfactory results, which is why the neighbour of the Netherlands, Belgium, followed a similar law a few years ago. Some of the others are actually in practice but not openly discussed because of legal ramifications. In terms of what we're talking about dealing with global poverty, again, there's a lot of people who are doing quite a significant amount in that area. So I think that while they're not all going to be put into practice overnight, and that would be a drastic revolution, maybe too drastic, because we couldn't cope with those changes all at once, I think the idea that these things which already exist out there in the world should become more prevalent would be a wonderful thing, would greatly reduce the amount of unnecessary suffering in the world.
Which of the ideas that you have defended do you struggle most with personally in terms of the outcome of the idea?
Well, I think all of them have difficult boundary issues, if you like. So, I mean, you raise questions about the possibility of defensible animal experimentation. I certainly struggle with that. There's issues about children with disability and that I think if the parents don't want them to live, they shouldn't have to require them to live. And again, where do you draw boundary lines for that? And what children can have good lives and should be rather adopted by families who would give them good lives. And then in the topic we were just talking about, obviously I struggle personally with how much I'm doing myself and how much we need to do and how we can best use that money to make sure that it's effectively used for the long-term and sustainable relief of poverty and improvement of the world. That's a big issue as well.
I'm nervous about raising this topic, but it is a topic you've raised yourself, and it's one that you've now been greatly criticized for. And that is, if one steps away from speciesism and recognizes no moral distinction in terms of the different species, any more so than one recognizes a moral distinction in terms of race or gender, in terms of racism or sexism, this may lead some people to say, well, human beings and animals can enjoy affectionate relationships that are indeed sexual at times. And you've recently gone into print and said that as long as the animals are not harmed, there's no moral objection to bestiality.
I haven't exactly said that. I mean, the only thing I've written on this is a book review in which I simply described what was in the book, and I said, look, a lot of people seem to have great abhorrence of this. Why is that? Is it because we're just trying to preserve this gulf between humans and animals again, and the idea that some humans might want to have some sexual connection with an animal somehow threatens the gulf that we'd like to dig between ourselves and the animals and, put ourselves up on a pedestal. And what I said is, look, obviously there are some forms of human sexual interaction with animals that are simply cruel and harm the animals in various ways. You can think of others if you want to. I don't know how graphic a description you want, but you can think of others where the animals are free to come and go if they wish, where they're not being harmed in any way. And so...
They consent.
If you like, they consent as much as animals can ever consent to anything. Yeah, sure. So is there really a problem here? What is the problem? Okay, it's a bit abhorrent. We see it as unnatural, as deviant and so on. But, that's how people used to think about other forms of sexuality that we now accept. So why is this particular taboo a taboo that has stuck, whereas taboos against masturbation or sexual relations between people of the same sex have not stuck? And I think perhaps the diagnosis here is that it's something to do with this gulf that we like to have between ourselves and animals. And as I said, I don't see much of a basis for that. But, that's not to say that there aren't any objections that anyone might have to it or that I'm sort of giving it my blessing or anything like that. Just to raise questions about why is it that we still have this deep abhorrence about something that you can hardly even discuss it. Whereas, as I say, with things like sexual relations between people of the same sex, we've definitely moved on, and I think progressively moved on to a more open attitude where we can talk about it and we don't have to regard people as somehow abhorrent or disgusting because they engage in it.
Well, again, I can anticipate someone saying the logic of that might take you to places that you really ought to struggle with philosophically and morally. For example, one might say, just as interspecies sexuality has been frowned on in the past, but there may not be a moral objection to it, intergenerational sexuality has been frowned on in the past and indeed in the present, but there perhaps should be no moral objection to pedophilia or to adults engaging in sexual contact with 10-year-olds who appear to give some recognition and consent to what's going on.
I think the issue here is whether this harms the 10-year-olds and will harm them in their sexual lives later on.
And there are some pedophile campaign groups who say there is no lasting harm.
Well, obviously you need to have a look at the evidence as to whether that's true.
If there was no lasting harm psychologically, would that pedophilic encounter be justified?
Look, I'm not going to answer that question because I think you have to really consider that question more thoroughly, and I don't think there is any kind of evidence about that, and I don't want to say things that some people will regard as justifying pedophilia when clearly there isn't
Isn't that the logic of your position, though? As long as the child is not, in the long term, harmed, you can't rule out the moral permissibility of that behaviour.
Well, I mean, I guess the logic of my position is that, as elsewhere, I'm a consequentialist. I'm concerned about preventing harm of various kinds. I don't have kind of intrinsic moral taboos, if that's your point. Yes, I don't have intrinsic moral taboos about that. So you can't rule it out
as a morally legitimate action?
If you think that whether actions are right or wrong depend on their consequences, you can't rule anything out until you know something about the consequences.
It's just wrong, though, isn't it?
No, I don't see that you can say that. That's not my view, right? My view is not that anything is just wrong, full stop. You're trying to put words in my mouth. You may think that, but, you know, I would say, why do you say that? I mean, maybe, you know, you have evolved as a being that has certain deep intuitions. Your intuitions are given by evolution. Certain kinds of sexual relationships do not lead to reproduction. We have evolved to have negative attitudes to those kinds of sexual relations. And that's true about...
In a sense, we're having a disagreement about what seems obvious. Someone would say to you, this is a moral failing on your part if you don't see that it's just wrong.
You haven't let me finish what I was saying, sorry. We have these moral intuitions, which we can explain in terms of evolution as to why we have them. And they would include a moral intuition against sexual relations between people of the same sex. And we know that there's a long history of persecution of people who have been homosexual. And we have now, fortunately, started to rethink our intuition, whereas a lot of people would have said, just as you said a moment ago, it's just wrong. Can't you just see that it's wrong? It's a moral failing on your part if you can't see that for two men to have sex is just wrong. Now, I don't think that it is. And as I say, many people have come to see that it isn't. So I just don't think this moral method of saying it's just wrong is a method that we should rely on, neither in this case nor in the others.
The positions you have been arguing for look difficult on first glance to reconcile with themselves. We should avoid eating meat in order to reduce suffering to animals, and yet parents should have the freedom to kill children under certain circumstances. We should give money to save people from poverty and death, and yet we can deny vulnerable children born with a defect the protection of life.
Of what? I mean, I think the consistent thing in all these is that I'm trying to reduce unnecessary suffering. I don't see that your problem about trying to reconcile them. In all cases, what I'm concerned about is reducing the suffering of animals who are raised for our food in ways that are often brutal and cause them to suffer throughout their entire lives. Keeping children alive, or in some cases allowing them to die, which is something that we often do with these cases. We allow them to die slowly and painfully, I think can in some cases cause suffering to the children and to the family who have to suffer with them through that. Not assisting people who are living in desperate poverty, who can't afford to give their children even the most basic medical care, so that they die from simple diseases like diarrhea, which could be cleared up for minimal costs. That also obviously causes an immense amount of suffering. So I think the common element is clear. It's trying to reduce suffering wherever there are cases where we allow it to continue, or sometimes we cause it and inflict it, where it's not necessary, is relatively easy to avoid.
Do you think there are any moral absolutes?
I think the moral absolute is that we should try to do what will have the best consequences for all of those who are affected by our actions.
Peter Singer, thanks for talking to me.